la palabra al doctor Ajay Dubey.
Okay, thank you. It's again a pleasure to be here. And it's the last time we're meeting, so whatever question you have, please do ask. Today, we are discussing a topic which is India related, but it's related to India engagement with a continent which all of you know is Africa. Africa, we are going to use more for the sake of convenience because understanding India-Africa relations is saying India-Latin America relations. Africa has 55 countries now, and each country has sort of different strength and weakness. Each country has different historical experiences, and each one has different relationship with India. So when we discuss about India's relation with Africa, I want to make it very clear in the beginning that we are not talking about a country. We are talking about 55 countries which has all the diversity. But for the sake of convenience of our discussion, we are discussing India-Africa relations. Before we start the details of India-Africa relations, its analysis, it is important for us to understand that where is Africa placed today and why India-Africa relation is something that we should try to understand. Africa, as all of you know, is 55 countries, and you have all the colonial powers of the past. You had good number of British colonies, good number of French colonies, good number of Portuguese colonies, some Spanish colonies which are still to be decolonized. SADR, Saharwadi Democratic Republic, where Polisario is still fighting for independence from Morocco, because when Spain withdrew, the issue of independence of SADR, Saharwadi Democratic Republic, was not settled. The African Union recognizes that republic, but Morocco does not recognize independence of SADR. It claims sovereignty, and it says that this region was part of Morocco, so it will not accept the independence of which Spain left undecided while withdrawing. So the point I'm making that Africa had almost all the colonial powers. Africa is also a single continent where slave trading was done in such large number that you find people of African origin spread all over the world who suffered what was trafficking in human beings. So one of the continents which suffered the most of the colonial impact, because very few other colonies in Asia or in Latin America suffered that kind of slave trade, that kind of trafficking or sale and purchase of human being as Africa witnessed. And therefore, it shattered the psyche of African for a long time to come. Africa was colonized also at a much later stage of colonialism. 1885, you find, 85, 86, the scramble for Africa taking place among European colonizers and the Berlin Conference, which took place in these years, decided the complete partitioning of Africa among different contesting European powers. So this 1885 is the time when Africa is getting colonized, formally partitioned by colonial powers. And this 1885 is also the time where India is launching its first political party, 1985, Indian National Congress, asking for freedom from colonial rule. So at one end, India and Africa, if you look at, India had its first war of independence in 1857, and first political party formed that remained in power after independence for more than 50 years. Indian National Congress was established in 1885. So there had been a connect between India and Africa because the colonial powers, especially the Britain, which had colonized India, started colonizing Africa by using its presence in India. So many colonial administrators from Britain who were working in India, they were shifted to Africa. They established the same kind of colonial structure, same kind of colonial administration that they had established in India. So if you go to Anglophone African countries, British colonial countries in Africa, you will find that you have same kind of administration. Almost all the laws that were promulgated by British in India in 1850s, 1860s, were just picked up completely and implemented in all these British colonies. So there is a legal similarity because India still uses the same law by modifying some of the things. So most of our law you'll find enacted in 1856, 1850, and the similar things you'll find. So the administrative setup, governance system, political setup, the kind of colonizing experiences, and also the legal system, all of them had similarity with British colonies in Africa because they were done borrowing it from Indian colonial administration. But besides that, there was also a very thriving contact in trade and commerce between India and Africa. As I was talking yesterday, all along the eastern coast of Africa, you have Indian merchants starting from Mombasa in Kenya port to Cape of Good Hope in South Africa on the southern tip of Africa. And they were there since very long time. When all these mercantile revolution that took place in Europe, Spain, Portugal, who were the initiator of that, they went via those routes. They came across all these Indian traders who were already settled and doing thriving business by the land route through the Middle East connection. And therefore you find that when they came, they recorded the presence of these traders over there. So there was a thriving economic connection between India and Africa before the colonial master came over there. And when the colonial empire was established in India and Africa, you find most of those relations were cut off. But by the time colonialism came in Africa, it was also a time, as you know, 1834, the slave labor was replaced by what we call indentured labor that we discuss. And that enabled, as we discussed yesterday, a very large number of Indians to go to British colonies in Africa. French also borrowed from these hired indentured workers, which the British recruited. And similarly, the Portuguese also borrowed from them. And therefore, we have a good number of immigrant indentured workers who went during colonial time as a part of replacement of slave workers. And they got settled in this over a period of time. The point I am saying that the connection of trade that existed before the colonial rule was now replaced by a massive migration of Indian professional indentured workers who were largely cane cutters to this part of the world. And when they went there, most of them got settled down there, and now we have around 3 million people of Indian origin in English-speaking, French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, Spanish-speaking Africa. So the connection remained, and the trade again started happening because good number of merchants from Gujarat went to the East African side. A good number of merchants from South India also went to the southern part of Africa. They are called Chetiyar. And therefore, there was a thriving trade connection. But the point I'm going to argue is that India and Africa had a very strong connectivity and relation which preceded colonial period and which became stronger even in colonial period because of movement of large number of Indian migrants to African territory as indentured worker. And there were also traders who moved during this time, and they were called free passengers. And these free passengers were largely traders and local retailers. And if you read the British writing of that period, they have recorded that wherever these traders are present, in whichever part of Africa, the British merchants have no chance of succeeding because they were so efficient, so well networked with each other, and so professional and cost effective that Dukkawala, the Indian merchant who are called Dukkawala, they occupied every corner shop of East Africa. By the time Africa became independent in many countries, people of Indian origin in British territories were a very well established group economically. In some countries, like in Tanzania, in like Kenya, in like Uganda, they used to own more than 40% of the GDP of that country. And similarly, in South Africa, they were very affluent, and there was good connectivity. But India, Africa, besides these economic trade links and besides the migration, had solidarity largely coming from the political diplomatic solidarity which started in late 19th century. And that solidarity is something that I will argue gradually, which gives the competitive strength which India has today in Africa, which no other countries of the world enjoys in Africa. And that gives the competitive strength for India's economic engagement in Africa. And that's where the Africa is seen as a prime economically targeted region for India now. And India wants to encash what is the historical goodwill. And how did it come about? As I was saying that there was a large migration of people, there were also good migration of people in South Africa. Today you have 1.2 million people of Indian origin in South Africa who form roughly around 2.5 to 3% of the population. They went there as a cane cutter, but when they were being discriminated by the colonial master and they were treated like the locals, the merchants who were present, who had gone as free passengers from Gujarat, they were very affluent, they didn't accept it. And they hired from India a barrister who was trained in London, who was British in every sense of the word, a British gentleman, but who had failed as a lawyer in India. And name of that person was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, whom the world knows as Mahatma Gandhi. So he was hired because he was not succeeding in his home state as a lawyer, as a practitioner, by these Indian merchants who were very rich, to come and argue their case in the court for discrimination against them. Because he was trained in, and he used to be suited, booted in all the British attire. And so when he went there, he used to behave like a British gentleman, so he bought first-class ticket, he was well-dressed, and he boarded the first-class compartment. And then the white people who are there, they said, no, the first-class ticket itself does not entitle you to board the first-class compartment. You have to go to third-class compartment, even if you have first-class ticket, because you are Indian. And he registered because he was trained and he was very successful a student in London as a law student. And he started arguing. So but the train kept moving, and then there came a station, Pittsburgh, which is near Durban, and they threw him out of the train forcibly, that you cannot board this train. And there, the lawyer who had gone to argue the case of the merchant from Gujarat became a freedom fighter's sort of person. And then he started his struggle against discrimination of Indians to begin with, and then the discrimination of the larger population, including blacks later on. And in that struggle, he discovered everything that he is known for: the peaceful, non-violent struggle, civil disobedience, truthfulness. All these things he tried to experiment, invent, and deploy to fight the colonial administration there. He kind of invented all these things because they were not implied. So when you have the protests going on and police will lathi charge or cane charge or will use bullet, they won't move out, but they will not become violent. There will be call for civil or disobedience, and all the civilians will stop working and protest into that. So there are several things that he invented there, and that became very successful, mobilized people, and it really threatened the colonial master because they didn't get excuses to crush them because they were not violent, they were not destroying the property, and they were all united in their protest. He also brought in women on the forefront of the struggle. And that he discovered that this becomes a powerful tool of protest. And therefore it is called that it's South Africa that converted Barrister Gandhi to Mahatma Gandhi. And in 1893 he established the first political party in entire Africa. There was no political party in the entire Africa anywhere. He established Indian National Congress, which was to fight a modern political formation, which was to fight against colonialism and discrimination. And that he continued fighting till in 1900, he shifted in the first decade of 1900 to India permanently. He used to come and go, but permanently he shifted to India, and there he decided to fight against Britishers and get freedom by peaceful, non-violent struggle in India. And that is where Gandhi became father of India, because he started the freedom movement. And his biggest contribution in the Indian freedom movement was that he mobilized the masses completely. And if the mass, the poor, the women, the rich, everyone is mobilized, it becomes very difficult for the colonial administration to sustain itself. And his biggest contribution was that he made it non-violent. He was almost completely inflexible on non-violent method, and he led that freedom movement for all time to come. And therefore the point I'm making that the Gandhi connection with Africa, converting a barrister to a Mahatma, to a father of a nation, which Mahatma Gandhi is called today, was made in Africa, made in South Africa. And that remains a very significant connection and debt for India to Africa. Therefore, all through when India was fighting its freedom struggle, you find that no other third world country, no other developed country took a position on Africa which India took. And I'll just narrate some of the development that will let you know how Indian position in Africa, Indian connection in Africa is unparalleled in the world for African country, which they accept even today. 1927, the Brussels Congress of oppressed nationalities took place. Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, and when India became independent in 1947. In 1927, he participated in that Congress. And there he met many of these Africans from Africa who had come to participate. And when he heard their tales of suffering, and when he came back to India, he moved the resolution in Indian National Congress, which was a well-established political party, and which was formed in 1885 with pan-Indian base, that our freedom is incomplete until and unless Africa is also free. That our freedom will not be achieved till Africa gets freedom. That African freedom is a continuum of Indian freedom. And probably we need to work for their freedom more than work for our freedom, because their condition is far worse than ours. And this was unimaginable position by a political formation which is still not independent, 1930. 1947, independence come. But if you read the annual resolution which Indian National Congress used to pass several resolutions in its annual conventions, there are at least 2 resolutions on Africa every year. One is that we must contribute to freedom of African countries. And no African countries at that point of time, no leader was asking, thinking, visualizing for freedom. There was no freedom struggle in Africa in any country till late 50s. But 1930 onwards resolution, you see. The second resolution was that racial discrimination of non-white people in Africa must end. And India will not sit back till it achieves that condition in Africa, and it will mobilize all its resources to get that. And you still don't think, still at that point of time, there were not many organized movements. Of course, ANC was formed around 1905 in South Africa. Many of them, African National Congress, East African Congress, all of them modeled themselves on Indian National Congress. They took the word Congress from Indian National Congress, and as they were Freedom Struggle Party, and all over you find this party coming up in Anglophone, in Francophone African country. And therefore, India took their cause very seriously, and African leaders remember and they acknowledge that by adopting the Congress as a name of their political party. India gets independence in 1947, and Nehru is interim prime minister since 1945. Before the independence is granted, he signs a order which made South Africa a pariah country for India. In 1946, South Africa had 5% of India's global trade. One country, South Africa, had 5% of India's global trade. Till 1994, entire Africa, 54 countries together, could not achieve 5% of India's global trade. But a country which is going to get independence in a few months decided on ideological basis to say, though the South Africa has very thriving economic connection with India, we will completely economically boycott South Africa. So no goods, no trade from South Africa were permitted in India from 1946 onward till 1994, when South Africa became democratic. It's a huge sacrifice, economic sacrifice. And as I was saying, till 94, all other 54 countries of Africa, when South Africa was removed from the trading list, could not even make together 5% of India's global trade. So it was a huge step that India took. All passport of India had, that's not valid for India, not valid for South Africa and a few more countries, Israel. So there were ideological position which India took. And it was not just economic, political boycott. India becomes independence in 1947. 46, it took the cause of racial discrimination of Africans and Indians in United Nations, 1946. Nehru, interim prime minister, sent the Indian ambassador to United Nations. As you know, India, before becoming independent, was signatory to United Nations. And for the first time, the human right clause was invoked by India. This is the only clause, if you invoke that, then the national sovereignty can be bypassed. In no other cases, a country can be forced to go by the United Nations decision. But if UN invokes human rights clause, it's a crime against humanity. Then the country, collectively, United Nations can take action on any country, even if that country is not willing. And India moved that resolution, India-Prussian resolution, saying that it's a crime against humanity and apartheid system, the racial discrimination must end. And therefore, it was for the first time it was taken over there. When Nehru took over the prime ministership in 1947, he called an Asian Relation Conference because other countries were getting independence from the Southeast Asia. But he invited many African, Western educated Africans from Africa to participate in Asian Relation Conference of 1946. And he established contact with them. Many of these leaders stayed in his house, Kenneth Kaunda, who became president of Zambia, who was there for 15, 20 years as president, stayed in house for many years, got all political apprenticeship. And there were so many leaders from all over Africa whom he called, trained them, supported them, and they became future president, prime minister of many of these African countries. And the first black African country to get independence was Ghana, 1957. And till then, all African cause was taken up by India in United Nations. When Ghana became independent, when other African countries became independent, the first building in which they opened their mission was Indian mission for United Nations in New York. The first pen and pencil that came for them was given by Indian mission. So, and in 1970, if you just read a special tribute that was paid by United Nations to India to take up African cause, which was chaired by a Nigerian, who was president of that committee. If you read that resolution, it exactly said the words that I'm saying. That the first mission that was opened, first pen and pencil that came, was through Indian mission in United Nations. So there were a great connectivity between India and African at political diplomatic level. And this was not, I would say, as altruism, as something which was not associated with national interest, which is what we understand. Every country seeks and promotes national interest. It was also part of India's national interest because Nehru, who was in charge of Indian foreign policy cell since 1930, till he became prime minister, until he died as prime minister, he believed that the Second World War has created a divided world of East and West. And he believed that country like India, which is the first country to get independence after Second World War, first colony to get independence, cannot join either of the camp. It is not in the interest of a country like India to be camp follower of the leftist Soviet Union or capitalist American bloc. Country like India must decide their own strategy and must work with the system that is able to deliver development, autonomy for their people. And if that is to be done, then he realized that independence of India is useless if it has no autonomy to decide for itself. Because in either camp you had to compromise your autonomy, your sovereignty. And he believed that that autonomy can come by following a policy of non-alignment, that you are not aligned to any of these superpowers. So he visualized that. But for him, the most important thing was that there has to be independence of all these colonies. And therefore he asserted from 1947 onward a new concept, what is called Afro-Asian resurgence, that countries of Asia and Africa who were colonial countries, they must work together to assert themselves, to find a space which is independent of influence of either Soviet bloc or capitalist bloc. And it is in this context that he decided that there should be an official policy of non-alignment when most of these African countries and Asian countries were getting independence. He had asserted the same thing in 1955 Bandung Conference, when till then not even a single African country was independent. 57, Ghana became first country to become independent. But 1955, when the Bandung Conference took place, he again asserted that Afro-Asian independence, Afro-Asian assertion, neutrality from the superpowers is what we must follow. And if this is what he followed, the solidarity, the priority, and the working for African independence was not really an altruistic thing, was also driven by a national interest, because Nehru believed the number will give him a space that he was looking for. The large number of Afro-Asian countries cannot be ignored by these superpowers as independent bloc if they work together, if they have solidarity. And this was the driving factor before him. All through his time, the economic relation that he conducted with Africa was, as you know, India at that point of time had mixed economy, but with priority, or what he called the command economy, to remain with the state, the consumer economy to remain with private sector. And in this connection, he employed and deployed all the state enterprises to coordinate with Africa, not the private enterprises as such. And he came out with a special guidelines that will make India-Africa relations different from the relation that North has with South. And some of those guidelines, if you read, that was given to all these companies, where you cannot deploy, you cannot use second-hand machinery, you cannot use the outdated technology. You must train the people over there, whichever enterprise you are establishing, and you must transfer the ownership of that enterprise over a period of time. And you must come back after that. So he wanted to make Indian economic engagement different from what the multinational of the North do in the South. And they will give outdated technology, they will not train the manpower, they will not pass on the technology, they will not come back from there if possible. So it was done all in clear contrast, because he really believed that until unless a country like India, which was economically advanced, does not do something which is positive, it will not be possible for a country. And therefore, what you know is South-South cooperation, which is different from North-South cooperation. He wanted to implement that. Of course, when the relationship develops, you have both private and state enterprises working together for that. And you have different kind of development, which is not really South-South cooperation. And I wrote a piece long ago in 1980s when I was a student that time, saying that it's a new pecking order, not a South-South cooperation. Because I examined the trade of 20 years, balance of payment, all other factors that explain the relationship. But the point is, there were attempts by political elites to transform the relation in a more equitable, mutually beneficial, and in contrast to North-South relation. That it didn't happen is a different thing, because economic forces had their autonomy to seek profit and to implement things which may not be what the political elites desires. Anyway, so during the Cold War period, during this stage of South-South cooperation, you find that there was a very strong desire to be different. And then China enters Africa. 1960s, China enters Africa, which is more than 100 years later of India's association with Africa. And when China enters, it changes the whole thing. Chow Enlai visited all African countries, well, many African countries, what is called Chinese safari by the premier. Nehru had visited just one African country, though despite all this solidarity. And China introduced a kind of force in Africa which was in clear contrast to India. Chinese said no collaboration, no negotiation, no petitioning to colonial master. You have to fight them with arms and throw them away. It was in clear contrast to India's own experience of peaceful decolonization. India was saying there has to be a coexistence of all these developing countries between the two superpowers. We are not trying to fight with one or other or both of them. There has to be coexistence. China said no coexistence. The imperialists cannot be allowed to be present. So there has to be outright fight with the capitalist. And the Chinese, of course, economy was stronger in monetary term, stronger in political term, because it was a member of United Nations Security Council at that point of time. So they could get many things to Africans who were getting impatient for decolonization, compared to India, which was teaching them peaceful decolonization, equidistance from the two superpowers, South-South cooperation, no hard money, full arms support, outright diplomatic vetoes, and that made many of African countries lean towards China. So much so in 1962, when China attacked India, though China and India had signed just a few years ago a very friendly treaty, and Nehru had not prepared himself militarily at all because he had a different agenda. But when China annexed Tibet, came to Indian border, and the Tibetan Dalai Lama ran to India, to whom India gave place to stay, the Chinese attacked India. And in that attack you find that despite so many years of commitment to Africa, Chinese were more friendly to, and Africans were more friendly to China than India. And that shocked India so much that from 1965 onward, after Nehru had died, he died in 1963, they really reviewed their Africa engagement. So all head of mission in Africa were called, and then they were asked that why Africans have sided with China and not with India. And we have done everything that is possible for them. China had just come there few years ago, not even a decade ago. And then India decided that it has to increase its economic content with African engagement, but India didn't have that much capacity to do as China. Anyway, as you know, by 90, the whole Cold War came to an end and the globalization started. India had its own economic crisis. For the first decade that we discussed, how it tried to mediate that with its diaspora. And for one decade of 1990s, it was internally engrossed to take care of its own problem. And that's the decade when China made full inroads in Africa. And it was present all over, giving huge amount of money. Because of the globalization, the Chinese countries were open to non-traditional powers, non-traditional countries. So during Cold War period, they were controlled by their colonial masters under neo-colonial framework. They were not allowed to move to other camps. But after the end of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, African countries were abandoned by the colonial master and North American thinking. There is no superpower which can now give support to them. So all the aid that was given to them was diverted to the Eastern Europe. And they were just left without any support, and they were asked to put their own house into order, to have democracy, to have larger economic integration at regional level and continental level, to allow multinational to come. They had to make what is called, investor-friendly climate, where they can bring in money, take money, make profit, and you don't do much with them. So all those things, the West was expecting the Africans will do. But in the meanwhile, the Chinese entered, the dragon entered, and they gave money, they gave support, they occupied all the space that was left by the absence of the West and absence of the Soviet Union. and they became very powerful in Africa. They exceeded the Western investment, the American investment in Africa. And soon by 2010 onward, it was realized, not even 2010, by beginning of the century itself, it was realized the Chinese have become the most dominant power in Africa. And by then, India has, of course, in one decade overcome its economic crisis. It has taken care of many of the things. And then it was again repositioning for its global lookout. And in that, it finds that Africa has been already completely influenced by Chinese presence, and India has become very weak. So in 2008, India launched what is called India-Africa Forum Summits, where it introduced a new concept of what is called Banjul formula. And India wanted again to prove to Africa that it is different from all other countries who were engaging the entire continent under the phase of globalization. So you have European engagement, you have American engagement, you have Chinese engagement, you have Turkish engagement, you have Brazilian engagement, and all of them were engaging by establishing a forum of summit-level meeting of all African leaders with their respective countries. So China has FOCAC, European Union had a meeting for the same thing, United States had this meeting, Turkey had its meeting, Brazil had its meeting. So everyone wanted to occupy the space that was available to enter Africa for economic gain, for economic engagement, which was in different area, because both the Europeans and the Soviet were not so present and were not influencing that much. And in that open space, India also thought that it has taken care of its domestic problem. It must enter into now Africa to reestablish its position there. And India-Africa Forum Summit, therefore, was organized in 2008, where again, in the pattern of African engagement, India engaged all African head of states. The only difference was that India opted for what is called Banjul formula. Banjul Summit of African Union had decided that all these countries which are engaging Africa, they must not engage bilaterally. Because if they engage bilaterally, all these countries, then these countries don't have the bargaining power to engage them and get the best deal from the economic engagement for Africa. But if they collectively engage Africa, then the collective strength of Africa will get better deal for Africa with any partner who wants to engage, like India, China. All other countries had refused to accept Banjul formula to negotiate with the collective strength of African countries as represented through African Union. And Banjul formula said that African Union will decide which 15 countries will participate. African Union will decide which project Africa will have. It will not have arms, it will not have palaces for the autocratic ruler. It will decide for people-centric project. It will decide whether the deal is something which is fair enough, or it is being done under bribe or being done under pressure of some country. But all other countries rejected, only India accepted it. And that's how 2008 India-Africa Forum Summit, 2011 India-Africa Forum Summit in Ethiopia, 2008 was in New Delhi, after 3 years it was in Ethiopia, and again 2015 it was in New Delhi. Therefore, the Banjul formula made Indian engagement with Africa unique. It committed in these 3 forum summits. The first 2 had 5 billion each in terms of economic aid. 2008, 5 billion. economic aid and 0.5 billion as assistance. 2011 again 5 billion and 7.7 billion as assistance, as a grant, and 2015 again 10 billion. So you have 20 billions aid committed to Africa. And these aids are not bilateral aids like what you have from developed countries to other developing countries. These aids were negotiated by African Union. African Union was present in all the summit, all that, how the money will be spent, on which project it will be spent, in which country it will be spent, and how it has to be spent in a partnership rather than giving just as a dole. So there was a different model of economic aid that was established under Basel formula, and these money were to be dispersed only under this. For the first time, India became aid-giving countries. And this is also a time when India has refused to accept aid from the major 5 donors that were giving aid to India. And India emerged as an aid-giving country, and of course it was a different model of aid-giving. Not to say that India's economic interest, India's national interest were not there. It was not altruistic, it was not charity. It was not out of good-heartedness of India. But what India wanted to show that what India wants from Africa is open and is on the table. What Africa should get from India, it's for the African to decide collectively and bargain collectively, and India is open to that. India does not want to enter into any shady deal, which many countries do. They will bribe most of these leaders. They will give arms and ammunition to suppress the opposition, and they will have whatever deal in terms of the trade concession, in terms of ownership or access to the mineral resources. They will do that. So this went very well, and this was very well appreciated by African countries, and therefore India-Africa engagement from 2008 to 2015 was under what is called India-Africa Forum Summits, which took place under 3 summits. In 2015, India-Africa Forum Summit also enlarged the Basel formula. It said, okay, we will invite African Union, we will go by African Union negotiation, but it found that African Union is playing politics with African leaders. It only selects only few of them. So it said, because that's what it realized in 2008 and 2011. So 2015, it retained Banjul formula, but it expanded the Banjul formula by inviting all African head of states. So around 43 or something of them had come for that forum summit, head of state and government in New Delhi, and all other 54 countries were represented at highest level. And therefore this one was done. The challenge is that these transactions are now going to take place through the private sectors, in clear contrast to what was during Cold War period through the public enterprise. And multinationals of the South, how different they will be in terms of pursuing their profit compared to the multinational of the North, is an open question. And we don't know. Since India has also gone for what you call neoliberal strategy, we call market economy, it is not possible for the state enterprise to go there. In fact, most of the state enterprises have been privatized in India, except some of the crucial one like ONGC, which is for energy resources. They are public sector enterprise. Most others are privatized. So the engagement is largely through the private sector. There is a very huge investment. The trade has grown tremendously from 10 billion what it was in around 2000. It is now around 100 billion US dollar. A tremendous growth in trade, and it's growing every year dramatically. There's a massive investment by private sectors companies like Airtel, which is telecom company, goes and buy the Jane Communication, giving one check of $10 billion. So there are several of them who are active. There is a huge export of pharmaceuticals products from India to all these countries because they are very, very cheap compared to the branded European products that are available over there. And also, there is a big movement of consumer goods from India to African countries. Of course, they are not able to compete with the Chinese in terms of price, but there is. The challenge again is the composition of trade is again not in light of what Africans would like to have. It's the export of the value-added items and import of primary products. Bulk of the primary products that India imports from Africa is hydrocarbon. And that's one of the prime objectives of India, to ensure energy security for growing India, which energy requirement doubles up every 5 years. And all external sources of energy supply like Middle East or Latin America or Southeast Asia are controlled by the established oil interest. And therefore, Africa has still many areas which are not discovered for these hydrocarbon products. So how to help them to discover and ensure energy supply for India is another one. Therefore, the 2016, I think I'll stop now. 2016, the India economic interest and other interest drives Africa on the following counts. And I'll give you in the nutshell. One is the trade, which is growing very high, around 100 billions now. Second is investment, which I said is to the private sectors in many of these areas, telecommunication, IT. India has gone for what is called Pan-African e-network, where all the 55 countries of Africa, their government offices and they will be connected through a network which India will pay for. And they will also connect it with India, and through that they will provide telemedicine, they will provide tele-education. And under India-Africa Forum Summit, India has given them huge number of 200 capacity building institutions are to be established. 80 of them have been already approved and they are under consideration. The theme of India-Africa engagement and the India-Africa Forum Summit is that India must do the capacity building and human resource development in Africa. It must do projects which benefits people, which are related to people, rather than to the head of states. Many of them are not very accountable head of state. So that's how these projects of India are working. There are 15,000 fellowships that is given to African students every year. There is a virtual university that is going to be established under India-Africa Forum Summit. So education, health, and communication is something that India is promoting. It didn't want to promote the governance issue because it's a very sensitive thing, but it does help African countries to train their people at provincial level or district level, local administration, and tie up with India to transfer the knowledge and share the knowledge with them. Therefore, in 2016, the economic goals of India in Africa are very clear. It's energy, it's trade, it's investment, it's market. But besides that, India also has political and security objective in Africa. India wants the United Nations, World Bank, IMF institution to be restructured to conform to the reality of 2016 rather than to keep it tuned to the reality of 1945 when they were formed. It wants more new members to come in. It wants more democratic space for the new countries that have come. And it wants African help to do that enactment because there are 55 countries. Their vote counts in United Nations. It also has 3% of its diaspora in Africa, which are not connected to India as the diaspora is connected in North America and Europe. The diaspora is still very apprehensive that if it connects with India, the majority community in this country might say that they are looking towards India, they are fifth column of India, so it's apprehensive. And the other factor that also links Africa with India, both economically and strategically, is IBSA and BRICS. As you know, these two new forums engage the emerging powers, and in that Africa is also part of that. South Africa is a part of that, and they are trying to work to find some space for new financial structures away from the World Bank IMF structures, where they will have more space and more autonomy to work together. Of course, they have challenges, but I will talk about them and if you have a question. And I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention. Yes.
Bien, pues hemos llegado a la hora de las preguntas, después de esta plática tan interesante que va desde el siglo XIX hasta el siglo XXI, las relaciones de India, sobre todo con África, y todo el proceso de liberación que han tenido estos países, y de alguna manera el ejemplo ha sido Mahatma Gandhi. Entonces, pues les dejo a ustedes la palabra si quieren hacer alguna pregunta. Sí.
Mike. No, yes. Yes.
¿Tú quieres hacer una pregunta? Ay, pues adelante, perdón.
Hi, good evening. My question is this connectivity between Africa and India stronger than the relation between India and its neighbor Muslim countries? I mean, is not this solidarity a way to defend themselves from the Western Asia or even from other Asian countries like China?
Yes, I think India and its neighbor, especially Pakistan, Bangladesh, they became a country in 47. And they became a country after carving out from India. So there is a historical, since then there is a historical issue that make the relationship with countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh a problematic one. But India has extremely good relations with countries like Bhutan. It had good relations with Nepal. Now there is some issues because of Maoist movement there, and there is some disruption there. It has good relations with Sri Lanka. But neighbors always have some issues. But so that is there. But Africa was seen as a region in whose decolonization, in whose democratization, India has contributed greatly historically. And it has not encashed those support that was given. Only when India is now growing economically fast, and Africa is looking for friends where it can diversify its dependence from the West, it can make new friends, engage new powers, there it is looking towards India. And the bigger issue for India is that given its limited resources, it is not able to answer their request. Indian engagement in Africa is largely request-based. They want more and more. But India finds it very difficult to meet their demand as other countries like China is doing. A lot of money, very fast execution of the project. India does not do that so efficiently even back home. So there is challenge, but India, of course, feels very close historically and finds Africa very close strategically, which does not have the bothering issues which many neighbors have around the world. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your conference. Last year, Professor Sanjay Subramanian visited us, and he gave a speech about the idea of barbarian in India, how the idea of barbarian people has been built along the centuries in a cultural way. So he analyzed different crimes in India committed by African people. And he said when those crimes happened, the newspapers wrote terrible things about African people because they are always, in cases of rape, they are always thinking in sex, they are violent people, and produce different waves of trade against Africans. But he gave many examples along centuries. But now you are giving us the kind side of this relationship about economical and political cooperation, the other side of the story. But I have a question about your book, Partnership, Africa and India Partnership. You said the first, during the, I don't remember, first or 5 years after the independence, obviously, India had a terrible economical problems, but India decided to invest in Africa. Could you give us more information about that contradiction?
Okay. Okay, first of all, I am not aware of the gentleman name that you are mentioning, so I don't know what he said. But it's true that there had been a cases of violence against Africans. And any violence which is directed based on the race, based on the xenophobic consideration, is highly condemnable. And I know dominant section of India, or the largest section of India, share the view that that professor told you. It is condemned, and we are all very concerned. We are all very apologetic. And I myself, as a professor associated with this issue, organized several conferences to condemn it, to mobilize it, to call Government of India to take a strictest possible option of violence against Africans. I'm very sorry to hear that somebody has given you a Trump-like view, which is not shared by most of us. And we see African as a human being like us. We have suffered the same way. We suffer same colonization, same racial contempt. To give you one example, Indians were not treated better under the apartheid system to begin with, until unless they fought for it. In 1920s, when Indians were agitating in East Africa, saying that you treat us like British subject and make us British subject, give independence to these people, or give representation to us as British subject in British Parliament. The British Parliament debated for 2 days and used the word, I will quote you, that if these Indians want representation in British Parliament, the mother of all parliamentary democracy, then let them know that these subhuman beings have no chance of getting that done. And if the British colonial administration in East Africa is unable to control the unrest, it can hand over the power to them and come back. So you understand that we have similar situation like Africans. It must be some very ill-informed person who could talk like this. I'm very sorry to hear that. It's not said by any academics or media and larger public. Some people, of course, will always have in every society a position which is about which we all feel sorry and ashamed of. That's the one. The second one is about what India did at the time of independence when it was weak. It didn't provide much economic support to African countries. But what it did, as I was mentioning, that in 1946 when Nehru signed the complete economic backout of South Africa, at that point of time, South Africa has 5% of India's global trade. And for any country to completely cut off 5% of its global trade is unthinkable, even today. But India made that sacrifice, and Africans don't forget that. So that was in terms of sacrificing and not resuming that till 1994, when South Africa became democratic. Nelson Mandela became the president. Till then there was no mission, no trade, and any goods which were going to come to India will not be accepted from South Africa. So that was the kind of sacrifice, and it was ideological. Nowadays they say it was not a right decision to go ideologically, because South Africa today prefers China more than India. But anyway, that was the lighter side of that, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Investment in the Belizean region. Could you tell me which are the perspectives of energía nuclear in Mexico? Nuclear energy? Did you know about it?
Well, I can tell you India's India nuclear perspective. Yes, an Indian nuclear perspective is clear that the traditional sources of energy, hydrocarbon, is in short supply, is limited to certain people now. And the new countries which are growing, they don't have adequate access and supply of them. Therefore, you need to have alternative supply of energy, which is solar, which is wind, and which is nuclear. So countries like India, if it retained its growth as the fastest growing economy of the world today, it needs adequate energy supply. But it cannot get it from the Middle East, cannot get it from Africa also. So it has to depend on solar energy, and it has taken a lead under climate change to establish that one. It can do for wind energy, it has limited potential, but it has great potential in nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy is a dual-use technology. You can use it for weapon, you can use the same thing, same reactor for producing nuclear energy. India has neighbors which had nuclear weapon. China had nuclear weapon. China not only had nuclear weapon, it attacked India in 1962 when Tibet was annexed. So India has to, and even today, a good amount of land is under Chinese occupation from India. In Ladakh area and also in Kashmir area. Okay. So India cannot just remain a silent spectator. It has to develop its nuclear energy both for civilian purposes and for protection in terms of nuclear weapon. On nuclear weapon, it has clear policy. India will be the first country to completely forgo its nuclear weapon and surrender if all countries of the world decide to do so. But if 5, 6 countries which have nuclear weapon, they keep possessing that, and they preach all other countries that your neighbor has it, however hostile is the neighbor, you don't have it, because it's not good for you. This discriminatory policy is not acceptable to India. And therefore it's not a signatory to Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. And it is here that India pursued its nuclear energy program for civilian as well as for military purposes. And only under Bush, and we discussed it yesterday, a Republican president whom India never supported by and large, always it supported Democrats, was responsible to deliver India a nuclear deal where India can continue with its civilian program of nuclear energy, can retain its weapon, but it will not be under sanction of United States and others for possessing that nuclear weapon or developing that nuclear weapon, because it is a responsible democratic country. And therefore, these nuclear weapon countries have said India remains a beneficiary of nuclear supplier groups, which the United States has formed to control non-proliferation of nuclear weapon, and it can still maintain its nuclear weapon and use, and all these countries will support the growth of nuclear energy supply for Indian growth.
Thank you.
Mexico, I don't know what is the position. Maybe somebody else will comment here.
Antes de que preguntes, quisiera saber si alguien más no quiere tomar la palabra.
And one last question. Do you think, what does mean for you the democracy? Gandhi used to say, the truth is still the truth. What does mean democracy for India? Is the same concept to everybody? What does mean democracy? Democracy is the same to reduce the poverty. What does mean democracy for India?
I think yes, different people will explain that. For India, democracy means that its diverse population is constitutionally, legally, and politically respected, that majority does not undermine the minority, that political power transfers peacefully by ballot rather than by bullet, that democracy is the most acceptable form of governance, though may not be the most efficient form of governance in terms of development. So democracy is a part of the constitutional strategy that India has adopted and followed and practiced uninterrupted till now. I'm not sure I could answer your question because it means different things for different person, yes.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, profesor Dubey, y a nombre del Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios en Economía Financiera y del Seminario Universitario de Estudios Asiáticos, queremos darle esta diploma. ¿Sí? Doctora Correa y yo. Ok. Bien, pues muchísimas gracias y lo despedimos con un aplauso. Okay. So
Thank you. I enjoyed my interaction, and it was very good to get your question, which could make me think on the topic in a different way that I used to think about the topic. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, a ver, profesor, aquí we're going
Yes.
to take a picture.
Okay.
Sí.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, really?
No, it is another one.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Muy bien. Bueno, pues now you go. This, if you want, I'm going to put it in your other, so you don't have to take it.
Es que ahorita no puede cargar casi nada, hay que ver eso.
No, ya, venía con